White teenagers buried an elderly black woman alive, and what happened in the end will shock you. But first of all, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the small town of Willow Creek, where whispers of the past lingered in every corner. It was a quiet, unassuming place. White picket fences, neatly trimmed lawns, and a deep divide that no one dared to speak of openly. For most kids in town, life revolved around school, sports, and the occasional mischief to break the monotony of small-town living. But for Dylan and his friends, that afternoon would set in motion a chain of events that none of them could have anticipated. "Come on, Jake," Dylan called out, leaning casually against his rusted pickup truck. His confident grin stretched across his face as he tossed a small rock in the air. "Don't be such a buzzkill. It's just a harmless prank." Jake hesitated, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his worn jeans. He glanced over at Chloe, who was perched on the truck's tailgate, scrolling through her phone. Her sharp laugh broke the tension. "Yeah, Jake, lighten up," she said without looking up. "It's not like we're actually gonna hurt anyone." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, Dylan. Miss Eleanor's just an old lady. What's the point?" The name hung in the air like a bad memory. Miss Eleanor. To some, she was nothing more than an eccentric old woman who lived on the edge of town. To others, she was the subject of whispered stories passed down for decades. The kids at school swore she was a witch, her small, weathered house surrounded by a garden of wild, overgrown flowers only adding to the legend. Dylan rolled his eyes. "Come on, man. She's not some innocent old lady. You've heard the stories. People say she curses anyone who crosses her. We're just giving her a taste of her own medicine." Jake looked away, unsure of how to argue. He didn't believe the stories, not really. But something about the plan didn't sit right with him. Chloe hopped off the truck, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. "It'll be fine," she said, her voice softer now. "It's just for laughs. No one's gonna get hurt." With Chloe's reassurance, Jake finally relented, though a nagging sense of dread settled in his stomach. The group piled into the truck and drove out to Miss Eleanor's house as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her home was a small, weather-beaten structure at the edge of a wooded area. The once white paint was now peeling, and the porch creaked under the weight of years of neglect. Still, there was something oddly beautiful about the place, the way the wildflowers tangled together in vibrant chaos, defying the neat order of the town. Dylan parked a little ways down the road, and the group crept toward the house, their footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. Jake lingered at the back, his nerves buzzing. "All right," Dylan whispered, his voice low but filled with excitement. "Here's the plan. We scare her, make her think we're some sort of spirits or whatever, and then, well, we'll see how she reacts." Chloe giggled, and one of the other boys, Tyler, smirked. Jake's stomach twisted tighter. Miss Eleanor was inside, her silhouette visible through the thin curtains of her front window. She was seated in a rocking chair, her head bent over what looked like a book. The light from a single lamp cast a warm glow around her. "Let's go," Dylan urged, motioning for them to follow. The group moved closer, their laughter muffled as they tried to stay quiet. Chloe held up her phone, ready to record. What started as a simple prank quickly spiraled out of control. Dylan, emboldened by his friend's laughter, banged on the windows and shouted nonsense about curses and spirits. The others joined in, their voices growing louder and more chaotic. Jake stayed back, his heart pounding. Inside, Miss Eleanor stood up, her expression unreadable as she moved toward the door. But before she could open it, Dylan had an idea. A terrible, reckless idea. "Let's really scare her," he said, grabbing an old tarp from the side of the house. Jake's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "Just trust me," Dylan said, a manic grin on his face. He motioned for the others to grab some dirt from the flower beds. "We'll make it look like she's been buried alive. It'll freak her out, and she'll never bother anyone again." Jake froze, the words chilling him to his core. "This is too far, Dylan. I'm not doing this." But Dylan wasn't listening. The others hesitated, but the fear of being labeled cowards kept them from backing out. Chloe, looking uncertain for the first time, glanced at Jake, but even she didn't speak up. The plan unfolded quickly. Dylan and Tyler distracted Miss Eleanor, luring her out of the house under false pretenses. They led her toward the edge of the woods, where the others had already started digging a shallow pit. Jake stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Miss Eleanor didn't fight back. She simply stared at them with an eerie calm that unsettled even Dylan. "You kids think this is funny?" she said, her voice low but steady. "You think this is a game?" Her words seemed to cut through the group, but Dylan laughed it off, throwing dirt over her legs as she stood in the shallow pit. Chloe's hands shook as she held her phone, the recording still running. Jake finally found his voice. "Stop it, Dylan. This isn't right." But it was too late. They covered her up to her waist with dirt before running off, their laughter hollow and forced. Jake stayed behind for a moment, his heart heavy with shame. Miss Eleanor didn't say another word. She simply watched him with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. The image of Miss Eleanor's calm, piercing gaze haunted him. What had they done? The next morning, the town was abuzz with whispers. Miss Eleanor had been seen walking through the market as if nothing had happened. She didn't mention the incident to anyone, but there was something different about her. A quiet determination that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. As he sat in his room, staring at the ceiling, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The morning after the so-called prank, Jake shuffled through the halls of Willow Creek High School, his head lowered as the muffled buzz of student chatter filled the air. His usual light-hearted demeanor was gone, replaced by a gnawing guilt that he couldn't shake. Every time he blinked, he saw Miss Eleanor's face. The calm in her eyes, the way she seemed to see through him, unafraid despite what they'd done. "Hey, Jake!" Dylan's voice called out from behind, his tone casual, almost oblivious. Jake turned, his expression tight as Dylan jogged up, a smug grin plastered across his face. "You good, man? You've been quiet." Jake hesitated. I think we went too far last night." Dylan laughed, slapping a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Relax, dude. She's fine. You saw her this morning, right? Walking around like nothing happened. She probably thought it was hilarious." Jake didn't respond. Dylan's laugh echoed in his ears, each chuckle feeling like a sharp jab. How could he be so indifferent? Before Jake could argue further, Chloe appeared, her phone in hand as always. She wasn't smiling like she usually did, though. Her brows furrowed slightly, and her voice wavered when she spoke. "Guys, we might have a problem," she said, holding up her phone. On the screen was the video she'd taken the night before. The clip showed everything. The shouting, the laughter, Miss Eleanor standing silently as the dirt piled around her legs. It all played out with startling clarity. "Why do you still have that?" Jake snapped, his voice harsher than intended. "I don't know," Chloe muttered, her hands trembling. "I was gonna delete it, but I don't know. Something about it feels wrong." Jake clenched his fists. The whole thing was wrong. "All right, chill," Dylan interjected, his grin faltering. "It's just a stupid video. No one's gonna see it. Just delete it, Chloe." But she hesitated. What if she shows up at the police station? What if she talks? Dylan's jaw tightened. She won't. She hasn't said a word. "Trust me." Jake didn't trust him. Not anymore. That evening, as Jake walked home from school, the world felt heavier. The sky was overcast, gray clouds hanging low, mirroring the weight in his chest. The familiar houses of Willow Creek blurred past him, his feet moving on autopilot. His mind kept replaying fragments of Miss Eleanor's face, her calm, steady gaze, and the eerie silence that followed. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the small envelope on his doorstep. It was plain white, with his name scrawled across the front in neat, looping handwriting. He bent down, heart racing as he picked it up. Sliding his finger under the seal, he opened the envelope to reveal a single sheet of paper. The message was short, but it chilled him to the bone. "You'll reap what you sow." Jake's heart thundered as he looked around, his eyes scanning the empty street. Who had left the note? Had anyone else received one? Without thinking, he crumpled the paper and shoved it into his pocket, the words burning in his mind. The next day, Jake wasn't the only one looking uneasy. Chloe had dark circles under her eyes, and even Tyler, who usually laughed at everything, was quieter than usual. Jake caught Chloe pacing near her locker, biting her nails. "Chloe," Jake called softly. She turned quickly, her expression panicked. "Did you get a note?" Her eyes widened, and she nodded. "Yeah. I thought it was some prank at first, but it's weird. Creepy." Jake exhaled, his suspicions confirmed. "Me too. What do we do?" she whispered. Her voice cracked, betraying her fear. "I don't know," Jake admitted, "but we can't ignore it." Before they could say more, Dylan sauntered over, his usual confidence intact. "You guys are acting weird," he said, leaning casually against the lockers. "What's going on?" Jake hesitated. "We got notes." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "Notes?" Chloe pulled hers from her bag and handed it to him. Dylan read it, his smirk fading as his grip on the paper tightened. He crumpled it and tossed it in a nearby trash can. "It's nothing," he said, though his tone betrayed him. "Someone's messing with us." "Who, Dylan?" Jake pressed. "Who even knows what happened?" Dylan didn't answer, instead turning and walking away. Jake exchanged a worried glance with Chloe. Something was wrong, and they both knew it. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. A search engine open but blank. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he felt like he needed answers. Finally, he typed Miss Eleanor Willow Creek into the search bar. Articles popped up, some dating back decades. Most were unremarkable. A community garden project she'd organized, a bake sale she'd hosted. But one article stood out. Local activist Miss Eleanor saves family from eviction. Jake clicked on it, his eyes scanning the page. The story was about a younger Miss Eleanor who had worked tirelessly to help a struggling family keep their home. The photo accompanying the article showed a much younger version of her, standing next to the family she'd helped. A man, a woman, and a young boy. Jake froze. The boy in the photo looked familiar. Too familiar. His heart raced as he realized why. It was Dylan's father. The following day, Jake confronted Dylan after school. He pulled him aside near the edge of the parking lot, away from prying eyes. "We need to talk," Dylan scoffed. "About what?" Jake pulled up the article on his phone, shoving it into Dylan's face. "About this." Dylan's eyes darted to the screen, his expression hardening as he read. "What about it?" "She helped your family," Jake said, his voice rising. "And you treated her like she's nothing." Dylan shoved the phone away. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know she saved your dad from losing everything," Jake snapped. "I know you've been lying to us about her." Dylan stepped closer, his jaw clenched. "Drop it, Jake." "No," Jake said, his voice firm. "I'm done pretending this is okay. You might be fine living with what we did, but I'm not." Dylan didn't respond. He turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there, anger and determination bubbling inside him. Later that night, as Jake sat in his room, another envelope appeared. This time slid under his bedroom door. He froze, staring at it for a moment before picking it up. The handwriting was the same as before, but this note was longer. "You have a choice to make. Fix what you've broken, or let the truth destroy you." Jake knew then that he couldn't stay silent anymore. The air in Willow Creek felt heavier as Jake made his way to Miss Eleanor's house the following afternoon. Each step toward her small, weathered home sent a fresh wave of anxiety through him. He couldn't ignore the notes, the guilt, or the growing rift between himself and Dylan. For the first time, Jake felt compelled to face Miss Eleanor, to understand her story and figure out how to make things right. When he arrived, the house stood as it always did, wrapped in silence and surrounded by its untamed garden. He hesitated at the gate, his fingers gripping the metal latch, before summoning the courage to walk up the creaking porch steps. Before he could knock, the door opened slightly, and there she was. Miss Eleanor looked at him with the same calm, penetrating gaze that had haunted him since that night. Her graying hair was pulled back neatly, and her face, though weathered with age, held an unshakable strength. "You finally decided to show up," she said softly, her voice steady. It wasn't a question. Jake froze, unsure how to respond. Miss Eleanor stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Come in, boy. We have things to talk about." Inside, the house was a mix of warmth and history. Photos and framed newspaper clippings covered the walls, each telling a story Jake hadn't taken the time to notice before. A small table in the corner was filled with books, many of them worn from frequent use. "Sit," Miss Eleanor instructed, motioning to a chair near the window. Jake obeyed, his heart pounding in his chest. She took a seat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "So," she began, her tone neutral, "what brings you here, Jake?" He struggled to find the words. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what we did." Miss Eleanor's expression didn't change. "Sorry for burying me alive? Or sorry because you're afraid of the consequences?" Jake's face burned with shame. "Both," he admitted honestly. For a long moment, she studied him, her gaze never wavering. Then, with a slow nod, she stood and walked to the corner of the room. She picked up a framed photograph and handed it to him. "Do you know who this is?" Jake looked down at the picture. It was the same one he'd found online, the younger Miss Eleanor standing with a family. He nodded. "I do. That's Dylan's dad." "That's right," she said. Her voice softened, but the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Years ago, his family was about to lose everything. His father was just a boy back then, but his parents, they had nowhere else to turn. The bank wanted to take their home, and they didn't have the means to fight back. Miss Eleanor settled back into her chair, her hands gripping the armrests. "I stepped in. I used what little I had to pay their debts because that's what we did back then. We looked out for each other, even when the world tried to keep us apart. But some people forget kindness as they grow older. They rewrite history to make themselves feel better." Jake felt a lump in his throat. "Does Dylan know?" She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Oh, he knows. He knows where his family came from. But it's easier to live in denial than to face the truth." Jake left Miss Eleanor's house that evening with more questions than answers. The weight of her story, and her forgiveness, even if unspoken, pressed heavily on him. As he walked home, the setting sun painted the town in hues of orange and gold, but the beauty of it was lost on him. He couldn't shake the thought that Dylan had known all along. Dylan's father owed his entire childhood to Miss Eleanor, and yet they had treated her as less than human. By the time he reached his house, the anger bubbling inside him was too much to bear. He grabbed his phone and dialed Chloe's number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice tense. "Jake, what's going on? Did you talk to her?" "I did," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to talk. All of us." The following afternoon, Jake gathered Chloe, Dylan, and the others at the park near the edge of town. It was a secluded spot, away from prying eyes, but Jake could feel the tension radiating from the group as they stood in an awkward circle. "What's this about, Jake?" Dylan asked, crossing his arms. His tone was defensive, almost combative. Jake didn't hesitate. "It's about Miss Eleanor, about what we did, and about the truth you've been hiding." Dylan's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jake stepped closer, holding up his phone with the article about Miss Eleanor's act of kindness. "I'm talking about how she saved your dad's family, how she gave them a second chance when no one else would, and how you've been lying to us this whole time." The color drained from Dylan's face, but he quickly masked it with anger. "That doesn't change anything," he snapped. She's still what, Dylan?" Chloe interrupted, her voice shaking. Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped forward. "A human being? Someone who didn't deserve what we did to her." The group fell silent. Even Tyler, who usually followed Dylan's lead without question, looked down at the ground, his face pale. Dylan clenched his fists. "You don't understand." "No, I think we do," Jake said firmly. "And I think it's time we did something about it." That night, Jake and Chloe sat on the curb outside her house, the cool night air wrapping around them. Chloe wiped her eyes, her voice trembling as she spoke. I hate that we let it go this far. Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty street. Me too. But we can't change what we did. All we can do is try to make it right. Chloe looked at him, her expression filled with both fear and determination. What do we do, Jake? How do we fix this? Jake didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they couldn't stay silent any longer. The morning was unusually quiet as Jake stood outside Miss Eleanor's house, his stomach twisting into knots. He had texted Dylan and Chloe the night before, insisting they all meet here, but now that the moment had arrived, the weight of what they were about to do felt suffocating. Miss Eleanor opened the door before he could knock. Her expression was calm but tired, as though she'd been expecting them. Without a word, she stepped aside to let Jake in, followed moments later by Chloe. They exchanged an anxious glance as they waited. The last to arrive was Dylan, his usual swagger replaced by a stiffness Jake had never seen before. Dylan stopped at the doorway, hesitant. "Why did you bring me here?" he muttered. "You know why," Jake replied, his voice firm. "It's time we face her. And the truth." Miss Eleanor's gaze shifted to Dylan, her expression unreadable. "Come in, boy. Let's hear what you have to say." Dylan reluctantly stepped inside, his shoulders tense. The room seemed smaller with all of them there, the air heavy with unspoken words. Miss Eleanor gestured for them to sit, but Dylan remained standing, his arms crossed. Jake broke the silence first. "Miss Eleanor, we're here to admit what we did, to apologize. It was wrong and we shouldn't have." "You buried me alive," she interrupted, her voice steady but sharp. The words cut through the room like a blade. "Let's not dress it up as a prank, Jake. Call it what it was." Chloe flinched, tears welling in her eyes. "We're so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what we were thinking." I wasn't thinking." Miss Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze moving to Dylan. "And you, boy? What's your excuse?" Dylan stiffened, his jaw clenching. It wasn't supposed to go that far," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. "We just wanted to scare you." "To scare me," Miss Eleanor repeated, leaning forward slightly. "Why? Because I live alone? Because I keep to myself? Or because you've spent your whole life hearing stories about me that aren't true?" Dylan's face turned red. "It's not that simple." "It is that simple," she replied firmly. "You believed the lies because it was easier than questioning them. Easier than questioning yourself." The room fell silent. Jake felt the tension building, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, it seemed like Dylan might storm out. But then he spoke, his voice low. "My dad always said you were trouble," Dylan admitted. "That you caused problems for his family." Miss Eleanor's expression didn't change. "And did he ever tell you how I saved his family from losing their home? How I paid their debts when no one else would?" Dylan's silence was answer enough. Chloe wiped her eyes, breaking the silence. "What can we do to fix this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We know we can't undo what we did, but we want to make it right." Miss Eleanor's gaze softened slightly as she looked at Chloe. Then Jake. "Fixing something like this isn't simple. It's not just about me. It's about this town and the way it's been for too long." Jake nodded. "We're willing to do whatever it takes." Dylan shifted uncomfortably. "What does that mean? What are you expecting us to do?" Miss Eleanor stood, her movements slow but deliberate. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled down a faded photo album, placing it on the table in front of them. "This town has a history," she began, flipping through the pages. The photos showed marches, protests, and gatherings, images of resilience and resistance. A history that people like your father would rather forget. But I remember, and I won't let it be buried, not by anyone. She closed the album and looked directly at Dylan. "If you're serious about making this right, you'll help me restore what this town has lost. The old community center. Do you know it?" Jake nodded. The community center had been abandoned for years, a crumbling building on the outskirts of town. "I want it reopened," Miss Eleanor said. "I want it to be a place where people can come together, where they can learn the truth about this town's history. And you're going to help me do it." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Jake nodded. "We'll do it. Whatever it takes." Chloe hesitated but eventually nodded too. "I'll help." All eyes turned to Dylan. He shifted under their gaze, his expression a mix of defiance and guilt. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll help, but I'm not doing this for you." Miss Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. "I don't care why you're doing it, boy. Only that you do it." The next few weeks were grueling. The community center was in worse shape than any of them had realized. Broken windows, peeling paint, and overgrown weeds greeted them every morning. Jake and Chloe threw themselves into the work, scrubbing, painting, and repairing what they could. Dylan was less enthusiastic, often working in silence and leaving as soon as the day's tasks were done. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. Other people in the community started to take notice. Miss Eleanor had a way of drawing people in, her quiet determination inspiring others to join the effort. Soon, neighbors who had once kept their distance came forward to help, bringing tools, supplies, and stories. Miss Eleanor told her own stories too, sharing moments from her life with the group as they worked. She talked about her involvement in the civil rights movement, the marches she had joined, and the sacrifices she had made. Jake listened intently, each story adding another layer to his understanding of who she was. For Dylan, the change was slower. At first, he avoided Miss Eleanor's stories, focusing on manual labor instead. But one afternoon, as he was patching a hole in the roof, he overheard her talking about his father. She spoke kindly, despite everything, describing how she had seen potential in him when others hadn't. Dylan paused, the hammer in his hand trembling. For the first time, he began to see her not as the target of a cruel joke, but as a person, a woman who had lived through more than he could imagine. By the end of the month, the community center was unrecognizable. Fresh paint covered the walls, the gardens were blooming again, and the inside was filled with photos and artifacts Miss Eleanor had collected over the years. The grand opening was set for the following weekend, and the entire town was invited. As they stood in front of the newly restored building, Miss Eleanor turned to Jake, Chloe, and Dylan. "This is just the beginning," she said. "You've taken the first step, but there's still a long road ahead." Jake nodded, a sense of purpose settling over him. "We'll be there." Even Dylan managed a small nod, though his expression remained conflicted. Chloe smiled through tears, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The morning of the grand reopening arrived with clear skies and a warmth that seemed to spread through Willow Creek. Jake stood outside the freshly painted community center, staring at the sign that now hung above the door. Willow Creek Center for Unity and History. The letters were bold, and beneath them, Miss Eleanor's favorite quote was etched onto a plaque. "The truth cannot be buried. It grows like roots until it breaks the surface." Jake had spent the past few weeks pouring everything he had into this moment. As he watched people begin to gather, neighbors, families, even a few kids from school, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The once abandoned space now brimmed with life. Old photographs hung on the walls, depicting moments from the town's history that many had never seen. One section of the center was dedicated entirely to Miss Eleanor's contributions. Her involvement in civil rights marches, her work in the community, and even letters she had written to advocate for change. Another corner featured a timeline of Willow Creek's history, highlighting both its progress and its struggles. Miss Eleanor stood by the entrance, greeting each visitor with a quiet dignity. She wore a simple dress, her silver hair pulled back, but her presence commanded attention. As Jake watched her, he realized just how much she had endured and how much she had taught him. Chloe arrived shortly after, carrying a tray of refreshments for the event. She looked lighter than she had in weeks, her smile genuine as she approached Jake. "It looks amazing in here," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Jake nodded. "It does. She deserves this." Chloe glanced around, then leaned closer. "Is Dylan coming?" Jake sighed. "I don't know. I told him about it, but he's been distant." Chloe frowned but didn't push the subject. Instead, she joined Jake in welcoming the guests, her energy infectious as she guided people through the exhibits. By noon, the center was filled with chatter and laughter. Jake felt a sense of pride as he overheard people marveling at the stories Miss Eleanor had preserved. Some visitors even came forward to share their own memories, adding to the collective history that was being rebuilt. Miss Eleanor eventually called for everyone's attention. The room quieted as she stepped onto a small platform at the front of the hall. She stood tall, her hands resting lightly on the podium. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice carrying through the space. "This center is not just about the past. It's about the future, about what we choose to remember, and what we choose to leave behind." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "For too long, the stories of people like me have been buried. The struggles, the triumphs, the sacrifices, they were ignored because they made people uncomfortable. But the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it's buried. And it's our responsibility to honor it." Jake felt a lump form in his throat as Miss Eleanor continued. Her words were powerful, each one striking a chord in the room. "This center is not mine alone," she said. "It belongs to all of us, to the people who came before us, and to those who will come after. It's a reminder that we are stronger together, that we must face our history with honesty and courage." The room erupted in applause, and Jake saw tears in the eyes of several people around him. Miss Eleanor stepped down, but before she could leave the stage, a voice called out, "Wait!" Jake turned to see Dylan standing near the back of the room. He looked out of place in his wrinkled hoodie and worn sneakers, but his expression was raw, his usual bravado stripped away. The crowd parted as he walked toward Miss Eleanor, his movements hesitant. I need to say something," Dylan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Eleanor nodded, stepping aside to give him the floor. Dylan turned to face the crowd, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I don't really know how to do this," he admitted, his eyes darting nervously. "But I can't stand here and act like I didn't play a part in what happened." The room was silent, all eyes on him. Dylan's voice cracked as he continued. "A few weeks ago, me and some of my friends, we did something awful, something I'm ashamed of. We hurt someone who didn't deserve it, all because we were too stupid and too scared to see the truth." Jake watched as Dylan's shoulders sagged, the weight of his guilt finally breaking through. "Miss Eleanor, you helped my family. You gave them a chance when no one else would. And this is how I repaid you." He looked at her then, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." Miss Eleanor stepped forward, her face softening as she placed a hand on Dylan's shoulder. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," she said gently. "But words are only the first step. What matters is what you choose to do next." Dylan nodded, tears streaming down his face. For the first time, Jake saw a glimpse of the person Dylan could be. A boy finally confronting his mistakes and trying to make amends. The event ended on a hopeful note. The community center was officially open, and for the first time in years, Willow Creek felt like it was moving forward. People lingered long after the speeches were over, talking, laughing, and sharing stories. It was exactly what Miss Eleanor had envisioned. Jake and Chloe stayed late, helping clean up after the last guests had left. As they worked, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The center wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of everything they had learned, everything they had worked for. Before they left, Miss Eleanor called Jake over. She handed him a small, framed photo, a picture of her younger self standing with a group of activists. "I want you to have this," she said. "A reminder of what we're capable of when we stand together." Jake took the photo, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you for everything," Miss Eleanor smiled. "No, Jake, thank you." As Jake walked home that night, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The stars above seemed brighter, the air clearer. He knew there was still work to be done, still wounds to heal and lessons to learn. But for the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. And he knew he would carry Miss Eleanor's words with him for the rest of his life. The truth cannot be buried. It grows like roots until it breaks the surface,